Thank you for joining the first of the evening meetings
I think everyone can.
For 2021. The presentation tonight, as you'll know, is being given by Scott O'Neill on assessing the depth of mine treatment. This is a live streamed event. And a recording should be available in due course. If you've got questions, if you can use the Q&A box, then we'll go through those at the end after the presentation. So our speaker tonight is Scott, who is a technical director from AECOM, where he leads the mining and remediation practice group. He has had a keen, interesting coal mining legacy in the UK and has worked in the field for over 20 years. Scott spent his early career working on small and medium-sized blighted, small-sized sites blighted by mining issues. He joined AECOM in 2006. His work has since taken him across Europe and the Middle East, working on many notable large and mega projects. And of course, he was a major contributor to the current Syria guidance, Syria C758 abandoned mine working manual, of which he was the joint author of Chapter 13. So without any further ado, I shall pass you over to Scott, who will take you through the presentation.
Thank you, Richard. Good evening, everybody. It's an honour and a privilege to be here to speak to you on behalf of the engineering group of the Geological Society. So as Richard said, my talk this evening is assessing the depths of mine treatment works. This is a light-hearted look at this subject. It can be quite a dry subject. It can be it's a subject certainly of interest to a lot of people. So without further ado, just briefly, as Richard said, my background is small and medium consultancy and contracting within the West Midlands and the UK, looking at mine workings. I'm then going to, as part of the talk, I'm going to talk about the history of the UK mining, the 10T rule itself. I'm going to set out exactly what is the 10T rule. You may or may not have heard it talked about. I'm then going to talk about shallow mine workings and what is referred to as shallow, depending on your point of view. I'm going to look at the failure mechanisms of settlement within coal mines. A brief interlude, I'm going to talk about a particular coal seam that I find particularly interesting in the West Midlands. There'll be a few case studies and a summary. So briefly about myself, as Richard said, I've got 20 odd years experience. I've been with AECOM for 16 and I'm a geologist in the Birmingham team within the Geotechnics group. I'm trained as a pure geologist. I'm educated in the Black Country. I'm sure my accent gives that away. And without a doubt, I'm quite biased. I do believe that the Black Country has some of the best urban geology in the UK. We're very fortunate to have coal and limestone and sandstones and some very interesting structures, as well as different types of geology and stratigraphy. My early career was spent at M&J Drilling, which is a specialist drilling and grouting contractor, and Johnson, Poole and Bloomer. And in particular, I need to thank Johnson, Poole and Bloomer because Colin Knipe, one of the directors there, has assisted me with this presentation and many presentations on this subject. JPB have got a wealth of experience in this area. Beyond dealing with mine workings at work, I've also got an interest in the subject outside of work, and I am fascinated by the way that the geology of the UK helped shape the Industrial Revolution, and I'll briefly touch on that on another slide in a minute. And again, as Richard suggested, excuse me, I was a contributor to Syria's C758, the guidance on mine workings, the mine workings manual, which replaced Syria SP32 about 18 months ago. which was a document that was around for a very long time, and we can only hope that the new document is around just as long. Now, as I said, this is hopefully going to be quite a light-hearted talk, so I'm just going to start with a bit of a disclaimer and a bit of a warning. I'm a geologist, and I'm sure many people watching tonight are geologists, so I often use words such as may, potentially, possibly, and other terms which engineers refer to as woolly and non-defined and non-quantified. I'm not going to apologise for using those terms, because I think it's very important when you're looking at certainly mining risk that there's always a lot to consider, and a lot of mining risk assessment comes down to engineering judgment, experience and consideration and understanding of a high number of variables. And then before I get into talk proper, I just want to put a quote up. Apologies if you've seen me talk before, I often start with this quote. I particularly like it, and it really comes back to my own personal interest in the way that geology and the Industrial Revolution in the UK are linked. And I won't read that verbatim, but essentially this is a quote from a book by Galloway, which is an introduction to the history of coal mining in Great Britain, which was originally published in 1882. I think the current version is from the 60s. Certainly the version I've got is from the 60s. It's a very well written book. It's very easy to read. And it's one of those books, if you've got an interest in this sort of subject, that you kind of read it and go, oh yeah, okay, I can see how this all ties together. And it demonstrates and it explains how railways, steam engines and locomotives all really came into existence due to requirements within the mining industry. And that's a fascinating book. If you can get a copy of that or borrow a copy of that from anybody, it's well worth a read if you're interested in this sort of thing. So onto the talk proper. So we're going to have a little bit of a brief history of UK mining. And as this is the GeolSoc is based in London, I did want to stress that not all the mining is up north. And I need to thank Mr. Harry Spillman. I'm not sure if he's watching tonight, but Mr. Harry Spillman did suggest to me that I should refer to coal mining in other parts of the country, in particular in the south. So coal mining in the UK started as surface winning or shallow pits. So coal, where it was exposed at the surface, was mined probably during Roman times. In the 17th century, wood was banned from glass production because chopping down trees was causing widespread deforestation. And so another method of creating heat and energy within glass production had to be found. And that led through coke and various other methodologies led to widespread mining. And really during the Industrial Revolution between about 1750 to 1840, the industrialised mining as we understand it really came to the fore. And it wasn't just coal. And a lot of my talk tonight is really about coal. I've got a few slides in from a few other extractive mineral industries, but predominantly, this is a coal talk. But we need to understand that coal and ironstone and fire clay and limestone were all extracted, and in many ways they were all taken out using the same methods, the same tools, and they leave very similar legacy problems for us to deal with. And also, I think it's important to bear in mind, given who we're talking to here as a group, that the geology as a science really helped locate coal seams, and they were interlinked, searching for coal in hillsides, searching for coal under the land, and understanding of how strata followed the land and was laterally extensive was really important to the coal industry. And obviously then as work and as technology progressed and as the science that I've already talked about and the technology improved, improvements fed through to underground mining, and mines were allowed to go deeper and deeper. So obviously originally the mines were, as I've just mentioned, at the surface. Then we went into a bell pit structure, which is what we've got a small image of here. Then we went into more extensive mining, but still quite shallow. And then technology allowed us to sink deeper and deeper shafts to the shafts that perhaps we were using towards the end of the coal mining in the UK, where shafts were hundreds of meters deep. So the peak of coal mining in the UK was just prior to World War I, and then between the 70s and the 80s, things really started to be scaled down. Now, of particular note to this talk, and perhaps particular note to the work that we all get involved with, is that in many areas of the country, coal was mined for a very long time without any records being made whatsoever. So we've got unknown workings. And that combined with the next point, which is in large areas of the UK and within the coal field, coal's within 50 metres of the current surface. So obviously we've got an unknown ground condition within 50 metres of the surface across a large area of the UK. And ignoring those 2 points can have serious financial ramifications on projects and the sort of projects that we're all getting involved with. And further to that point, 11% of the UK is underlain by coal mining. And I'm going to come to the Coal Authority on a couple of occasions during this talk. So the Coal Authority categorise mining as high or low risk. The image that you can see here to the bottom right of the screen is an image taken from the Coal Authority viewer, which you may or may not be familiar with, which provides map of the UK, very similar to the BGS viewer, and that puts over the top of it coal mining, and it identifies high and low areas along with other features in the same way that the BGS viewer does that you may be more familiar with. And then the image above that is a copy of a deposited mine plan. So this is the sort of record that would have been made following 1872 and was deposited with the state as a record of coal mining that was undertaken in any given mine. Now, I'm going to come back to these plans later on, but it's important to just bear in mind at this point that these plans were only really a requirement after 1872. They were made slightly before that, but they may not reflect truly the workings that were undertaken on any given seam, and you'll see how that's important to assessing sites later on. Right, okay, I'll go on to the next slide, which is this is quite an interesting slide, and this shows the main coal fields of the UK, and I apologise for the crudity of the graphic here, but it shows the main coal fields of the UK and how they're really tied to urban environments and cities. And these two things are obviously intrinsically linked. The coal was sought, people moved to where the coal was, and as a result, urbanisation increased in those areas. And so now, conversely, we have a problem where we have urban environments with large coal mining legacy problems. And I think these two, as I said, admittedly crude images show that quite well. Now, as I said, not all of the coal is up north, and if you look on this image, you'll see number 18 there, which is Dover. Now this is a little fact that not a lot of people are aware of. Even the people that work in the coal fields aren't aware that in Kent there was a coal field for a very short period of time, perhaps 25 years. And the coal in Kent was located due to boredom. So the guys were on site digging for the proposed Channel Tunnel at Shakespeare Cliff. And I understand from records that works had stopped because of various financial issues and other concerns around whether this was a viable project. And somebody had an idea of just drilling some holes for the fun of it, and they found coal. And that led ultimately to 4 shafts being sunk and 10 collieries across the site. Across the area, sorry, not the site. They didn't last very long. They weren't overly productive, but it is worth noting that coal isn't just up north. Right, so that's kind of an overview of coal mining in the UK, very brief, admittedly. So, as I said, this talk is about the 10 times rule. And really, it's not a rule, in my opinion. It's a guideline, and possibly it's not even a guideline, it's just a concept. And hopefully through the next few slides, which are very light-hearted, you'll get an idea of where I'm coming from. So what is the 10 times rule? So it's a rule that is often misinterpreted and uses a blanket approach to assessing the risk of residual mining voids from reaching the surface, i.e. it's a rule used to consider if a site or a proposal is safe from the risk of residual mine workings. And it's generally quoted or misquoted as something along the lines of shallow workings at a depth of 10 times the seam thickness below ground level are not a problem to development. Now, there's a lot wrong with that statement. And so I've highlighted a couple of key terms there that I will come back to as we go through the presentation. So shallow, seam thickness, surface, and not a problem. So let's start with shallow. So how shallow is shallow? I also apologise for how bright this slide is. I feel you need sunscreen for something this bright and this yellow this late at night in the winter. So the Coal Authority defines shallow workings as lying at a depth of up to 10 times the thickness of a coal seam extraction down to a maximum depth of 30 metres. However, they do go on to suggest that underground workings deeper than 30 metres do not readily constitute a threat to surface stability due to the ability of the overlying strata to dissipate any movement from the workings before they reach the surface. Okay, I think I follow it so far. Now, this text is taken from the Coal Authority website, and again, I've kind of just purposefully quoted the bits I want to. So I suggest that after the talk, you go back on the Coal Authority website and have a look at and putting this sort of text in context, and don't just take this as it is on its own. And I'm sure if there's anybody from the Coal Authority listening, they'll be head in hands at the minute. So please go and have a look at the whole context here. This is just to illustrate a point. And so in addition, Network Rail considers shallow mine workings to be within 50 metres of the surface. So already we've got a bit of a contradiction, and it's all a bit variable, and it's a bit woolly, using the term that we came from earlier. So what does 10T look like? So here we've got a very simple sketch that roughly at scale, showing a ground model of made ground, superficial materials, some coal measure strata and a coal seam. So taking the rule on its own, that looks like it's kind of okay. We're probably going to be all right with that. But then, you know, what's this made ground, and what's this superficial material, and what condition is all this this coal measured material in? And we need to really think about those points when we're looking at our ground model and we're doing our desk study work and our investigation work. And then obviously on top of that, so that kind of answers the first thing. You know, what is shallow? So where's the ground level? So these little blocks here represent some structures that we might want to put in. We might be wanting to put a structure in at the surface, or possibly something with a basement or a piled foundation, or something's deeper. And perhaps we might even want to do some tunneling work. And so suddenly we've moved the surface and we've changed things quite considerably from our original starting point. And these are the sort of points that are often missed when people look at the 10 times thickness rule. So really, shallow kind of depends on your perspective, and so does ground level. So that's kind of not really discredited, but it's kind of giving you an idea that we need to start thinking about this rule and how we apply it. So what about seam thickness? So the seam thickness, so we've got a layer of coal strata underground. The work thickness might not actually be the seam thickness. So we might have a coal seam that is 1 metre thick. Now, when workings were progressing underground, obviously the coal was taken out wherever possible, support was left in place. Roadways were required for pit ponies and people that were working in the mine to push tubs around with coal in or haul coal around. So quite possibly, if you've got a thin coal seam, the worked area might actually be greater, because for the roadways, we might have increased the height and dug up into the roof rock, or dug down into the rock below. And equally, where we'd got quite thick seams, it could be the case that the miners would leave a thin layer of coal in the roof, or a thin layer of coal in the floor. And so suddenly we're changing the work thickness and we're changing the seam thickness. And that's important to think about. Okay, now I appreciate that's all been a bit flippant there. So a bit more seriously, let's talk about failure mechanisms. So failure mechanisms are linked to the type of workings. Now, in large parts of the UK, failure within coal seams took place immediately after the completion of mining. Certainly within coal measures deposits, that happened in a large area. Not everywhere, must stress, not everywhere. Room and pillar workings and variations were often used to mine stratified minerals. Now room and pillar workings, essentially the miners would go into a horizon. They would create these roadways that I've talked about, and they would work out from the roadways, leaving supporting pillars in place, possibly of the mineral they were mining, possibly of wooden props, possibly stone and other supports, later on steels. And that's really where this 10 times rule should be applied. So there are other forms of mining. So there's longwall mining, which is the sort of industrialized mining that we've all potentially seen on the TV. And that creates completely different problems and settlement patterns. And this talk really doesn't touch on that, but that's important to bear in mind. You know, we're here to talk about and just look at the 10 times thickness rule. And we also need to remember that where we've got mine operations, we may have had a lowering of the groundwater level. and that may now have rebounded. And so we may now have ground conditions that are completely different to how they were originally. We may have a reduced ground level at the surface because of urbanisation. We've got voids and roadways and possibly open voids or closed voids within the ground itself. And we've got a groundwater regime that may have changed as well. So suddenly we're introducing all sorts of variables into this idea that we can apply a rule to failure mechanisms. Many of these here I've already touched on. So we've already talked about when mining was completed, voids may have remained in the ground. As miners retreated from coal seams and coal workings, several things often took place. Areas that were open, where they'd worked, or roadways, were possibly backfilled with waste material. That could be coal that was of poor quality, or building materials, or other materials that they no longer needed. And this would be packed into those open areas to help support the roof. In addition, as they retreated from mines, the coal pillars and with other stratified minerals may have been robbed to get extra material out of them. So we may have originally had a pillar which, for illustrative purposes, for argument's sake, was 2 meters wide. And on retreat, that may have been reduced down, reducing the ability of that pillar to hold up the roof. We've already talked about groundwater rebound. And so all these things come together, and we have to consider them and use our knowledge and our experience to see how those are going to impact on the type of foundations that we might be using at the surface. If we ignore these things, and we ignore the research information, and we don't do enough research information, we're going to get problems, and problems in the sort of work that we do will lead to financial implications, and as will the late identification of hazards. And that's a theme I want to just touch on here, and I'll come back to it later on. My opinion personally is that a lot of these sort of things get flagged very late in project development. So I'm sure everybody here gets involved in, or has been involved in projects where we're looking at foundations, and we all know that the sooner we can identify any geotechnical hazards or any geological hazards, the more time we have to deal with them, and generally the less financial impact and program impact they're going to have onto a project. So the next illustration just draws together some of those ideas. And this is an image that's taken from a book by Tony Waltham, and it shows something called a real subsidence. So you've got a couple of the things going on that I've been talking about here. We can see the coal strata underground, and this illustrates it quite nicely. We can see the voids where material has been taken out. On the left-hand side of the screen, we can see that the pillars have failed. So we can imagine, based on what I've just been talking about, that in this area, the mine has been abandoned. As the miners have left the area, they've taken this material off the pillars. The pillars have been reduced in capacity. They failed. They failed en masse in an area, and we've got subsidence at the surface. Then as we move down the dip, we've got an area where we've got a very similar situation, but we've got a stable roof rock. And roof rocks are very important when we're assessing mine workings. If we've got a stable roof rock, workings that perhaps would have collapsed now may remain open. And I know that we're talking about an industry that was perhaps several hundred years ago, but these things are still open. And time again, through the work that we've done and the work that we've all seen, these things are still in the ground. And we shouldn't think for a second that this will have gone away or been dealt with, or any subsidence has already occurred. And then we can see that we've got a groundwater table that kind of comes in and touches the lower workings, and where the groundwater has got into the underlying coal measures material, it's softened that material, and the overlying overburden pressures have pushed the pillars into the ground. And so we've got a similar subsidence event to the one where we've got multiple pillar failures, but we've got a completely different cause. And we've also got the same sort of settlement feature in an area where we've got what should be a stable roof rock. And so all these things have to be considered. Now this is really what the 10 times thickness was really designed for, is supposed to capture. So we've got, again, on the left hand side, we've got the open void in the coal mine, and then moving over towards the right, we've got progressive failure, where ultimately we end up with a crown hole at the surface. And then again, on the far right, the illustration shows how a strong, stable roof rock might stop that migration. Now, next slide. Thanks to Colin Knight from JPB for this one. This is an old photograph of an open cast site in the West Midlands. And what we're looking at here is workings in the thick coal. So these pillars are substantial pillars. They're 4 or 5 meters high. The pillars in the foreground here, we can see they're quite angular, they're quite robust. They look like they're, they've essentially been uncovered by the excavator as they've been removing the overburden material. And then as we move towards the middle of the image, we can see pillars that perhaps on first thought you might think, oh, they're pillars that have been damaged during the excavation process, but they're not. They're pillars that have been exposed as they were. And we can see where the pillars are slightly smaller and there's a spalling around the pillars. And these are pillars that have potentially failed due to robbing and the other processes that we've talked about. So this gives us a really good idea of what this looked like. Obviously, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to go down into an old mine and have a look at this this sort of phenomena. But here we can see it, and it can help visualize what we're trying to deal with at the ground. And then going that previous slide where I showed the progressive crown failure. This is an old image, but it shows the same sort of thing, again exposed in an open cast site. And we can see the various stages of crown hole development moving up towards the surface. And just for scale, there obviously, if you can see, there's an old truck of similar, or truck or something on the right hand side that we can see. So we can see moving across here, we've got various crown hole development at various stages, and it looks like there's potentially a stronger material at the top, or possibly even overburden material. It's quite hard to tell. Now, an interesting feature that I've seen, and I know other people have reported, and I've talked about already briefly, is that the workings would have been kept open by the use of props. And quite remarkably, in a large number of cases, these wooden props have remained in the ground. Now, this is interesting on a number of fronts, because if you read through contemporary mining books from the time, props are noted to fail on regular occurrences, they rot. And yet here we go, we can see that in the right conditions, they do remain. And that these are courtesy of Chris Bullis from GIP. And in particular, that one on the image on the left here goes in quite a long way. We can see that going in, and that's quite a substantial void on its own that has remained open at a fairly shallow depth. And obviously on the image on the right, we've got something very similar, and we've also got some groundwater contamination, some mine water waste and some ochre around that. So that creates another problem that we might have to deal with old mining. I just want to talk about, just very briefly, the Staffordshire thick coal. So this is a particular coal seam that is unique to the West Midlands and the Staffordshire coalfield. And it's a very, very thick seam, and it's separated into 3 leaves. A total thickness is often greater than 10 metres. And it may have been worked to one or multiple levels using various levels as roof rocks and support. And it was probably mined by pillar and store methods. So the same sort of process that we saw at the Dibdale site and a few slides ago, sorry, would have been used in this. So now we've got a potentially very thick seam of coal with large pillars in it that potentially might be open in places. So another issue around the thick coal is because it was so profitable, and we'll come on to an image of what it looked like in a minute to give you an true idea of the scale. It was repeatedly reworked, and some subsidence might have happened in some areas and some might not have done. So you could get an occasion, if you're sinking boreholes, one borehole might pick up broken ground and voids, another borehole might not. And it's important to remember, not just with the thick coal, that when we're drilling at the surface into coal mines, we have to bear in mind that these coal mines were often very irregularly laid out. And it's very easy to drill into a coal mine and find nothing but solid ground and solid coal, even when you've got mining plans showing you otherwise. And that could possibly be interpreted as collapsed ground, so the ground is closed up. But there's at least one case locally to me, and I know there's been, talking to many people, there's been other cases where ground investigations have been planned and proposed, and boreholes have been sunk, and through coincidence, for want of a better word, every borehole has gone through a pillar. So if we go back to this image here, if you imagine, we add many meters of overburden onto the top of this, and then we design our GI and we start sinking boreholes. It's not unusual to be unlucky enough to go through each solid pillar here and think that the problem is nowhere near as bad as it truly is. And that's something just to bear in mind. So the thick coal, so how thick is the thick? Now, as I've said, it could be up to 10 metres. And so here's, it's exposed in another open cast site in the West Midlands. This is now a housing development. And while I've been talking now, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but that's a 360 excavator there. So that gives you an idea of how thick this coal seam is. It's phenomenal. And the amount of material that was taken out of this in the Black Country in the West Midlands is quite significant. And in some cases, obviously, we've still got these large voids. We can see on this image that there's potentially some crown holes, perhaps in the middle of the image. There's water coming out to the left-hand side of the image. So there's a lot going on here. And if we haven't got images like this to try and visualize what's happened and what remains at depth, will be quite difficult. Right, so now I'm going to talk about a few case studies. This first one is a residential development in the north of the UK. I'm not really going to mention it too much in detail in terms of name. It's not a project I was involved with or AECOM were involved with, but it's a project that's quite well known. If you want to find out more, it's widely discussed on the internet. It's a housing development, and from what I can gather, there was some original investigations in the early 2000s, and there was some construction work. Some houses were built in 2011, and by 2015 there was some subsidence already being noted within the housing. There was some cracking, some displacement of structures, and families were permanently relocated from a number of properties in about 2017. Now, something I just want everybody to think about here is we're always obviously trying to do our best with everything that we do, and the best in our work. And the distress that these people must have gone through to know that their house was developing cracking, to not know was it going to get any worse because of the nature of this subsidence on this location. If we think back to a few slides ago where we'd got a sort of a trough of depression, you know, some people could have been living on the edge of that and not be having any problem whatsoever. Some people in the middle would be having quite a lot of concern because there was a lot of cracking, a lot of movement within their house. And then you get the people on the periphery where they got some movement, but it wasn't as bad. And so you've got a whole sort of community that's worried about, is their house going to be next and how bad is it going to be? So this is important to just think about when we're assessing mine, the risk from mine workings. We need to think about the end user to make sure that we focus our minds. So the Coal Authority were called in to investigate here. An additional ground investigation was undertaken, and ultimately 5 properties were rebuilt. So just looking at that in a little bit more detail. So it's estimated between April 2016 and May 2018, somewhere between 320 to 600 mil of settlement was experienced by some properties. Now, the Coal Authority undertook a 2-phase GI. The first phase obviously trying to identify what was going on, and the second phase more targeted to try and pick up other areas. There was, I understand, a mining plan held by the Coal Authority which identified a roadway within influencing distance. Now, I'll come back to that in a second. So a number of seams were identified. The main seam that seems to be potentially at fault here was a seam at 34 to 43 metres below ground level and was somewhere between 2.7 to 3.37 metres thick. I've also put 4 because there's some suggestion that perhaps in 1 or 2 boreholes it was 4 metres thick. And obviously we need to think about that. We need to look at those numbers, and we need to think about the ratio going back to the 10 times rule. And this is kind of on the borderline of on paper, was this a problem? Was it not a problem? Again, I can't really comment on the original work that was done, but we can see there's some interesting themes going on here. There was a sandstone roof rock above this seam, but it was shown to be weak, laminated and fractured. And another interesting point here that I've tried to follow through on the talk so far is that extraction for this particular mine was considered to be 75% in plan area. So a lot of coal was taken out of this site. So I've put this slide up again, or this image up again. So workings were present and unidentified, or were they too deep to have been flagged as an issue? I don't know. Again, you know, I'm just using this to illustrate a point. And I think it's important to bear in mind that presumably the plans were reviewed, and perhaps the plans didn't give an accurate or representative idea of the actual amount of working within a seam. So at this location, we'd got something, you know, a real subsidence, which was possibly a multiple pillar failure situation that we've got illustrated from this earlier slide. So I'm hoping now you're kind of getting the idea of what needs to be considered and all the variables that have to come into assessing mine workings when you've got this sort of situation. Now, this second case study is a job I was involved in probably about 15 years ago. And it was a scheme in the potteries. And we were called out. I was called out to a project that was already ongoing, and it was a new highway that was being put through a hillside. And on site, investigations had already been undertaken, and there was a drilling and grouting remedial scheme already ongoing. However, following a weekend of heavy rain, crown holes appeared at the surface. So the sort of hole development that we've seen on the earlier slides, we'd got these actually made it up to ground level. And also there were a lot of soft spots starting to appear across the surface of the site where excavators and dumpers were kind of sinking into the ground more than just in normal mud. And when I got out to site and we started to look at what was going on, we quickly established that the site had got a multi-layer of seams. So it hadn't just got one or two seams, it got multiple seams. And this next image, just shows a composite. It's quite busy, and I've done that on purpose here. This is a series of mine plans. So the abandonment plan that we saw in a much earlier slide, several plans combined onto one drawing to give you an idea of just the extent of workings beneath the site. And you can also see just from the scale of this image that we're talking about quite a substantial cut through the hillside in the middle of this image. And that's obviously changing the ground level, which is something that we talked about much earlier on. And again, this image picks up on what was shown in the previous image. It gives us some outcrops and it gives us mine shafts. So all of these points that look like they're borehole annotations are actually identified mine shafts. So in addition to the workings that were being treated, the shafts were being looked after and looked for. And again, this gives you an idea, if you're not familiar with the heavy mining environments in the Midlands and perhaps the north of the country, the sheer scale of this incredible industrialisation that went on, and the number of shafts that were sunk, and the locality, and perhaps many of these shafts will work in the same seam. So as a seam was abandoned by one mining company, perhaps they went bust or they'd made enough money and they were quite happy, they went off to live a happy life, they would backfill the mine shaft, somebody else would buy the land, they would sink a new mine shaft, probably very close to the original mine shaft, and work would start again. So the end result for us now as engineers and geologists is that we've inherited this landscape, which has been heavily worked at depth and is potentially pockmarked at the surface by mine shafts. Now, I must admit, I think this is a pretty bad drawing, but I'm going to give myself the benefit of the doubt that I did this a long time ago. But this gives you the idea very quickly of the number of seams that were present underneath this site at relatively shallow levels. These boreholes weren't very deep. They were perhaps a maximum of 25, 30 meters deep. So assuming, we correcting for the horizontal and vertical scale, we can see that we've got a number of seams here. Many of these seams were worked, but it did create a very interesting problem that had to be dealt with in terms of treatment going forward. Obviously, we didn't want to treat everything. If we started to treat grout, if we started to pump grout into a mine seam to fill voids, we wanted to ensure that it wasn't essentially running off away from the site or below the area of influence. So we had to put cut-off barriers into the seams using a much coarser material to stop the grout running off site. And this image hopefully gives you an idea. So if we go back to one of these, that photograph is looking to the west here, so looking to the left of this image, and you can see the cut that's been created in the hillside. And the reason that I just wanted to give you that kind of establishing shot here, you can see the various steel casings in the middle of the image where grouting works are ongoing. Is that as part of the main contractor's plan for this site, he'd identified that the coal was there. So the coal on this site wasn't an unknown, it was a known quantity to a point. Perhaps the extent of workings wasn't as previously thought, but certainly in this situation it wasn't. The contractor believed that he was going to be able to go in and win some of this coal out, mine the coal out and sell it. And in the end, what turned out and what transpired is that the seams had been more heavily worked than had been shown on the mining plan. So again, we've got that reoccurring theme of over extraction above and beyond what was on the mining plans. And so these few images just show you where coal was exposed at the surface. I don't think at this point this one was actually worked. But again, the contractor's trying to recover what he can here. And on this particular site, if we were to move to the left of this image, so still within the cut, we came across the feature that's shown in the left-hand image here. Now, this is quite an interesting one. Again, we've got some backfill or a crown hole in the middle of this image, where we can see we've got some dark grey coal material, mudstone material. Then we've got a creamy coloured material at the top. So there's something going on there. I'm not 100% certain on this image whether the void that these props were holding up was completely open when it was excavated, or whether we're looking at something that was caused as a result of the excavation works themselves. But it gives you an idea that, again, that the props are still in relatively good condition in this location. And then on the right-hand side of the screen here, we've got the results of a trial pit that I instructed the guys to undertake on site within the road level. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got soft spots that the dumpers were kind of dipping into. We picked a few of those. We undertook some excavation works, and here you can see the dark black shiny coal on the top of the image. We've got a mudstony shaly material coming through the middle, and then we've got two voids at the bottom that look like they're crown holes migrating up to the surface, and that more competent material in the middle has potentially prevented this crown hole getting any further at this location. Just a few more images, because this site was particularly interesting. Again, on the left-hand side, we can see that that's a trench box that you can see there on the right of this image. That's not something that we found in the hole. We've got a void at depth in the image. It took a lot of willpower as a geologist not to get down into that trial pit and have a nose around there with a torch to see what I could see. But we can see that the pillars here have potentially failed. Now, again, the pillars have failed, and we've got what looks like some movement and separation within the beds and some downward tilting of the strata above, which is quite interesting to see. I'm pretty convinced, looking at this and what I could see on the other side of this trial pit wall, that this wasn't caused by the excavation works, and this was as a result of natural subsidence arising from within the mine workings. And then again, on the image on the right, which I apologise for the poor quality of this one, we can see some more mine props that are in pretty good condition, and we can see, I think on the right here, we've got a propagation of a crown hole, whilst on the left we've possibly got, looking at the angles of the cut here, we've got the original worked roadway or worked area of the mine. And so just briefly to summarise that one. That site was a complex multi-layered problem. So we had to consider crown holes moving from one seam into another. So whilst it's quite easy to say our crown holes potentially don't move very far, and that the 10 times thickness rule doesn't apply, once you start introducing more workings above, then one void would migrate up into another void, and the dynamics have changed yet again. And again, the workings on that site were probably more extensive than previously considered. The ground level, so again, we're back to one of the points from earlier, were completely changed. The hillside was cut into, so the coals were kind of lifted closer to the surface. And obviously, in terms of the engineering, they had to be considered. These slides really do illustrate that the voids in places were very well supported and remained open. There was at least one cut within at least one void within the cut slopes that I think it would have been very easy to walk into. And standing from a safe distance, I couldn't really see where that finished. So I don't know where I could have got to if I'd have gone into that. So in this case study, 10T was never really an option, but again, it illustrates the kind of mining problems and the complexity and how things can rapidly multiply in terms of engineering considerations on these sort of sites. And finally, this is a one-slide case study. This is just something that Colin Knight from JPB passed me. This is some work that he did a few years ago, and it's looking at void migration above the thick coal, the seam that we saw in a couple of slides earlier, within the Black Country coalfield. And we can see at the bottom, we've got a couple of hundred observations, and we've got various layers above: mudstone, sandstone, or just sandstones. And we can see that really the broken ground isn't really getting that far above the workings. So again, that kind of questions the 10T rule and whether it is applicable or not, and something else for consideration. Right, so very wary of time. So in summary, the 10T rule, I I've pointed that out and I've established that that is now for you. It only applied to crown hole migration from workings. There are other settlement mechanisms that occur in other types of working, but I specifically just wanted to touch on the 10T rule here. It can really give you an underestimation of the risks posed if you don't fully understand all the other things that are going on the site. And I'm hoping that if you've taken anything from this brief run through, this kind of flippant run through I've given you here, is that there's a lot of things that if you haven't come across these sort of sites before, there's a lot of things that you have to look at. There's a lot of questions that you should be asking. The use of mining records is always invaluable, but they're not gospel. They're not set in stone. They aren't an absolute inviolable record of what occurred at any one site. And I should point out that the Coal Authority are very helpful when you're going through this sort of risk assessment process. And I found, certainly from experience, that the earlier that you engage them, the more productive things can be in terms of reaching a conclusion and getting an understanding of what's going on. So tied into that, desk-based research and where possible, ground investigation should absolutely be undertaken. The ground investigation to prove the desk-based research, and that should feed into your ground models. And obviously the ground models will then feed into the design and selection of foundations. I'll come back onto the next point in the next slide, but it's important to evaluate the model. And you know, we're all scientists. We all should be prepared to change our mind and change our thinking, and perhaps throw away what we've done and think, well, maybe that's not actually what's going on. And certainly when you're dealing with mine workings, it's very easy to go off on a tangent and think you've got an understanding, and then you'll find a plan, or you'll find a photograph, or you'll find a reference to something else that was going on in the area, and that will change your understanding and change where you think you need to go in terms of any remedial works. It's really important to point out that historical mining is fraught with unknowns, and I'd like to think I've demonstrated that. And there we go. Just to absolutely reinforce the point, I've doubled up here and I've put in consult the Coal Authority again. So that's really important. As was mentioned at the start of the talk, I was involved with Syria C758D, which is the Abandoned Mine Workings Manual. It's quite a thick tome. You don't need to read all of it. Section 5 covers what I've really talked about here, if you want to go and have a look at that. But it is a good starting point whenever you've got a mining problem. You'll find me on LinkedIn if you want to talk mining any further. I'm quite happy to have discussions. And I just want to put up the next slide, really. So this is something that I'm working on. This image isn't 100% finished, but it's trying to just reinforce that when you're looking at ground models for mining, you know, you don't ever stop. So you start with your desk study work, you do a coal mining risk assessment. I appreciate I haven't got into what a coal mining risk assessment is today. I'm quite happy to talk to anybody that wants to talk about one of those separately, or again, Google is wonderful, and we'll point these things out. You need a ground investigation, and the ground investigation in your risk assessment, many of us know this, but I think it's important to reinforce this. You know, they need to feed into each other. And coming back to what I've just been saying, don't be afraid to change your mind. Go back and question what you thought was going on. And with mining works, I find, and maybe it's because I'm a little bit of a geek at heart, you know, I've got a habit of reading old mining textbooks, and there's a lot of information that comes out of those about how mines were actually sunk, and how shafts were sunk and how mines were driven. And once you start to get into that sort of thing, it gives you an idea of what you might be finding when you're just using boreholes at the surface. So then you've got to look at review your risk assessment, design remedial works, go to site, do some remedial works, and if you're not getting the answers that you thought you were from the remedial works, go back and look again. I hope the Tunstall, the potteries case illustrates that. So always be prepared to review and renew the data that you're getting and change your ground model. And that's really my talk. I did just want to put this one up because it was just too coincidental not to mention, which is it looks like we're going back into mining, people. This is quite an interesting article on the BBC website from coincidentally yesterday afternoon. Whether you think this is a good idea or not from an environmental point of view, let's not get into that now. But here we go. Coal mining perhaps isn't dead in the UK, so that's something to think about. And maybe we need to look at innovation and new technologies of how we can make that more sustainable and more green friendly if we can. So finally, the last slide here is a little bit of a conceit. But I think it's a cracking photograph. That's not coal mining. That's a very famous limestone crown hole that appeared in the West Midlands about 20 years ago. But just from a case study of really bad health and safety, I thought that was really good. So we've got the guy peering in on the left. We've got the guy with the tape measure standing on what looks like completely undercut ground. And we've got a whole bunch of people standing around without any PPE on whatsoever. So that's my talk. I hope that was okay, and I hope you kind of gained something, or perhaps you've thought, I'll go away and look at that in a bit more detail. I'll hand back over to Richard, and I will try and get myself back to the start and see where we go from there. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. That was fantastic. We have, as you'd expect, quite a number of questions that have come through.
Do you want to put me on the screen if you can, Richard, so I can look like I'm sweating while people are asking questions?
Indeed, I will. There we go. I shall choose yourself. Add from video. Okay, there we go. I think you should be coming through there. Right. Okay. Send live. Right. There we go. Oh, you.
Yeah. Hang on. I'll be with you. There we go.
There we go. There we go. Right. Okay. So the questions are still coming in. We'll try and get through as many as we can.
I will if I can answer them. I might have to.
There are a number about ground investigation and what methods would you suggest? There's a number of people asking whether geophysics should play a role.
Right. Okay. Let's try and get all that in. So, an interesting, and this is based on personal experience. I've used geophysics on a number of projects. On some projects, it's been really, really successful. Notably, looking for adits, not necessarily mine shafts. So, adits are where a mine entry has been driven through a hillside to chase a seam down, and adits are often driven where you've got surface workings that were then exhausted, and the mineral deposit was chased down dip. On adits, I've had good experience. On shafts, I've had mixed experience, and I've used surface geophysics. I've used downhole geophysics. One of the issues I've come across personally, and I think this is a reflection of the area that I've predominantly worked in, is within the Black Country, within the West Midlands, we have, because of the industrial history, we have excessive amounts of made ground. So we can have sites with 7 and 8 meters of made ground. So if you imagine you've got a ground surface where the shaft has been sunk, you've then got a lot of made ground on top of it, and that made ground can be a real mix of materials. And invariably, I think, again, personal experience in the West Midlands, where I've used geophysics to look for shafts, I've had to go back and prove it with boreholes. There's an interesting problem that is starting to become a reoccurring thing for us now, is that we often get asked to go back and look at sites where treatment occurred perhaps 20, 30 years ago. And so we might have a mine shaft with a concrete cap on, and obviously the concrete cap is going to have steel reinforcement. Hopefully will have steel reinforcement in it, and we tend to be able to find those a lot easier. So really, I like geophysics, and I'm really keen to see what we can do with some of the more, geophysics, as with all technology, keeps moving on. I'm always very keen to see what we've got and what we can use to try and use it. Honestly, I think it's definitely the way we need to be going. But I do wonder if right now, if we've got the technology to the point where it's the be all and end all. And I find that whatever we do with geophysics at the minute, we always end up drilling a hole anyway. And so from a cost benefit to the client, is it better to just go and drill a hole or not? And there's always that argument. And so really, I'm going to sit on the fence with that. And I'm going to say with geophysics, I'll come back to ground investigation in a minute, but I'm certainly going to sit on the fence with geophysics and say, really, I think you've got to assess what tools you've got available, what techniques you've got available to use. You need to look at your ground model. You need to think about, the client's aspirations. If we're talking about on a project, and see whether you really think that the geophysics is the right way to go. Sorry, no, I'm going to sit on the fence with that one. But in terms of investigation, in fact, I was on a call with somebody earlier, and we were talking about mining, and they said, right, okay, you've got 3 boreholes in this 100 meters of this linear project to look for mine workings. We only want you to do 1. We think that's perfectly acceptable. And I had to point out, no. And I think hopefully I've illustrated to that talk that when you've got such an interesting or potentially interesting legacy feature at depth, you really need to put down, I won't say as many boreholes as you can, but you need to ensure that you've got a good understanding of where the holes are going. And really with mine workings, that's why I cannot recommend the use of GIS and georeferencing enough with this sort of stuff now. I was saying to Richard earlier, I was once berated by a very senior member of Scott Wilson's, as it was at the time, mining team, when he caught me with a site plan, tracing paper and pens, and I was doing all the overlaying by hand. And the idea there was to try and put the pillars from the mine plans onto the current site plan to try and work out where things were, and to try and avoid the pillars, or in some cases purposefully try and hit them to prove where they were. For the ground investigation. So I think it's key that you do a really good desk-based study first before you get onto the investigation. Obviously, if you pick the project up and you've already got some investigation, then try and use that and feed that back into that ground model development. But using georeferencing to create composite images and composite plans is really invaluable, and I think that's something that we need to be doing more. I know a lot of people are already, but I mean, certainly I'm not guilty of using it enough. And it's something that within the practice group that I lead within AECOM, we're really trying to push to deal with that. And one more point on the ground investigation that is worth bearing in mind when you're looking at all of this, and it was touched on very briefly on the multi-layer problem that I showed, is mine plans are flat. You know, you have to remember that you've got a dip, you're following strata into the earth, and you need to try and account for that and bear that in mind. And try and think about how these mine plans are surveyed. Originally, they were done using ropes. Ropes would get wet, they'd stretch, so things weren't drawn accurately. Then they moved on to chains. All that, you know, this isn't what I'm trying to establish, or what I'm trying to point out is this isn't a straightforward subject. It's really quite, for what it is, it's, as somebody once said to me, it's drilling holes in the ground and filling it full of concrete. How hard can it be? You know, there's a lot more to it than that, but in its essence, that's what it is. But there's a lot of factors to consider. Did that answer that one, Richard?
Yes, yes. Should we go on to another one? There are a number of questions about the 10 times seam thickness and whether that applies just to rock or whether it applies to superficials such as very stiff clays.
Yeah, okay.
And I suppose included in this is another question that asks, you talked about the intact rock or the competent rock above a void. I suppose this all plays into the same question really about what does 10C actually take into account.
Well, it goes back to that. You know, the Coal Authority have got a definition around shallow workings, but really it's competent rock. You need to have, sorry, in the true sense of the 10T rule, it's 10 times the thickness of competent material. And what is competent material, I think, really comes down to you as a geologist or an engineer. And I certainly, you know, my experience in Scotland is limited compared to, I'm assuming, some of the people on the call, but I know, you know, the glacial tills in Scotland can be very stiff. Are they stiff enough to stop crown migration? Potentially in some cases, potentially not in other cases. The example that I talked about with made ground, you know, what is the made ground? Is that a suitable material? Certainly, if you've got weathered mudstones, is that a suitable material? And so I think that the thing with assessing what is the right sort of rock for the 10T thickness is really kind of up to you to look at as part of your assessment of the site, and whether you feel that the material is competent and capable of essentially choking off that void migration if it was to occur. If you've got free-flowing gravels or loose gravels at relatively shallow level, obviously you wouldn't want to include those. And so I think that's really where the 10T rule can fall down, and it needs to be, the whole ground model needs to be considered. You might find that you need to get much greater than 10 times the thickness of the work seam, or even the work seam plus a bit to account for any roadways, before you get to a point that as an engineer you're happy. And this is all about, this is what I'm trying to establish. It's a risk assessment process, and you've kind of got to, I can't give you an answer and say, oh, this will be fine or that'll be fine. You need to look at the ground model on each and every occasion, and that's really the point. It's not one rule fits all.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. This actually, Adam Mitchell's asked a follow-on question, I suppose, to that. Is can you confirm that the 10T rule is based solely on the mine workings and nothing to do with the structure above, i.e. a single-storey light-framed extension would be treated the same as a multi-storey house, I suppose a heavy structure, of both founded at existing ground level? So I suppose based around the load of the structure.
Yeah, but if I think to try and answer that, so we're talking about a small structure with 10 times the cover to rock, 10 times the cover to the work thickness against a substantial structure. Well, I think in the first, if you've got a large substantial structure, what's that founded on in the first place? So you might find that you can't put a large structure onto made ground or superficial material. So you're starting to excavate in and create a basement. So again, you're changing the ground level, which is something I picked up on earlier. So I think if you follow it by the absolute letter, yes, but it is, it treats everything the same, but it shouldn't, because you should be bearing in mind what you're building, what your development in, and what your proposals are, and what you're going to do. It's really, this is a common thing that I get on this is people trying to pile above workings, and where do you draw the line? And how do you treat workings and pile through and sleep through? How far away from workings do you have to be with the base of a pile to be happy that there's not going to be any negative repercussions in the future? Again, I'm trying not to give the same answer, but it's a risk assessment process that you've got to go through to look at that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. There are a number of people saying are agreeing with you that the 10 times thickness it really isn't a rule. Norman Brook at Leeds Uni showed that research that 10T could be anywhere between 7 times up to 17 times in practice. So it's coming back to that same theme, isn't it? About don't blindly follow the rule, I suppose.
And there's something that I haven't touched on at all here, and to a point I've purposely avoided it, which is there's been a lot of very good academic research around this, very good. And some of it takes you down the road of we should FEA model mine workings to see what happens. And I think I can probably say that when we were preparing the Syria guide, that theme, that topic came up time and time again of, well, we should be saying that you should be doing a numerical model of these mine workings to show if your structures or your proposals are safe. And the reason that didn't appear in the Syria guide, in the main body of the text, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn for Syria here, is that really everybody that was involved with Syria appreciated the sort of things that I've talked about, that you've got so many variables that it's not a case of one situation fits all. And certainly, a lot of the cases that I've seen, briefly that slide I put up by Colin Knipe, and I know Ian Fraser did some work as well, shows that in fact voids don't migrate very far at all. Yet you look in other parts of the country, this is in the West Midlands, you look at other parts of the country and they migrate much further. And certainly I'm not an academic out and out. I'd love to have the time to look at this in more detail, and I'm sure there's a very good PhD in it for somebody if they're really interested to try and pull together the boreholes that the BGS have got and the Coal Authority to try and make some real assessment of this. But it's certainly not something that we should just be applying everywhere verbatim without thinking about it.
Great. Okay, I think we've
I'm
probably.
all right for time. If there's anything else, or if
Shall we? There's a couple of questions about remediation, and I think at that point, I think we're slightly running over at the moment, but I think we could probably squeeze.
I'm fine. I know this is sometimes a topic that people want to discuss.
Yeah. Well, this topic could go on for a little bit. Let me find. So let me see. I've just. So there was a question about the second case study that you put up.
Yeah.
A question is if there was a lack of understanding on what had been worked, and how did you decide on the grid of grouting, and over what area as well?
Right. Okay. Hang on. Let's find. Now, I must admit, this is as I said, this is a job I did 15 years ago, and I've pulled out of cold storage for this talk. I was quite pleased just to find some of these images. Okay, so there's a couple of images here that we can refer to. So from memory, we made an assessment based on everything that I've talked about in terms of where we felt was an acceptable cutoff level for treatment. Now, I must admit, genuinely off the top of my head, I can't remember what that was, and that wasn't why I put these slides up. But we certainly took that. We essentially drew a line that followed the topography of the highway, and we put in the curtain wall at that point in every seam to make sure that we weren't losing things off site or down dip as it was. And in terms of lateral extent, I can't actually remember what we did, but I'm assuming that we would have gone several meters, an area of influence off the end, and either angle drilled or put in a curtain wall on the sides as well. But beyond that, it was I think it would have been a typical kind of 6 meter grid with secondary holes and tertiary holes. So essentially you end up with a grid of holes at 6 meter spacings. If any one hole takes over a set amount of grout, you then start drilling the holes in between each hole until eventually you tighten the whole grid up until you can't get any more grout in the ground. I apologise, that was a pretty bad answer, but predominantly that's because I can't actually remember what we did because it was so long ago. But they're quite nice photos, which is why I included them in the slide.
And just to wrap it up in terms of the life cycle of a scheme, there's a couple of questions about remediation, mainly about geogrids. And what are your thoughts about using geogrids as well, it says in mine workings and mine shaft stabilization. Now I know that's slightly off what we've been talking.
No, I'm quite happy to talk about that. So I quite like geogrids. You look at what's on the screen at the minute. If this image is up, there's a lot of work going on there. You've got a couple of rigs on site. You've got a whole load of grout. You've got a lot of mess. You've got a lot of environmental issues that you've got to deal with. Geogrids are very good, in my opinion. Geogrids are very good in the right application. So, if you've got let's create a scenario. We might have open space or a car park. And it's that cost risk benefit to the client. If we think we've got workings that are perhaps on what we feel is a borderline depth of being a problem. Now, again, what's a borderline depth? Well, I referred to previous comments about you've got to do a risk assessment, so bear with me. So if we've got something that's on a borderline depth, and the client accepts that the consultant feels, or the geologist, the engineer feels that there is possibly a small risk to the surface. It's not a massive risk. We're not expecting large crown holes to open up. We might have the odd feature, and the client buys into that message. Then geogrids are very good. They're relatively easy to put in. They're very good. I've certainly we've used them where we've got mine shafts that perhaps have been treated historically but we've got some confidence in what was done. So when it comes to mineshaft treatment, a lot of sites, especially if you go, again, I know I keep referring to the West Midlands, but in the West Midlands, obviously a lot of shafts were treated as part of the motorway network. Some of the records around those treatments aren't very good. The same with other linear developments from perhaps the 80s. You might just have a note on the drawing saying treated shaft or treated with a cap, and that's it. And we don't really know what we've got. If you think that perhaps the risk from that shaft isn't significant because you think it's either been infilled and or it's got a concrete cap of the right sort of size, then I don't see a problem with using a geogrid if the end result is going to be lightly loaded. That's something else that we haven't really talked about here at all, which is heavy loading, light loading on shafts and standoff distances and things like that, which is again, it's a whole separate topic. So to answer the question, yes, I like geogrids. I think they're a good idea. I think perhaps we don't use them enough where we could use them. I think I'd be very keen to see where we're going as an industry with instrumentation and geogrids, so we can see in advance if we think we're getting some stresses building up and we think there's something going on that we can look at it. It's a cost benefit thing. So if the client wants a site that they don't have to worry about ever again, be whatever it is, car park, road, highway, rail, then a geogrid is potentially not the right way to go. If we've got a site that the client accepts the possibility of some residual risk and they're quite happy that they might have to go back at some point in the future and do some more expensive civil engineering works, then perhaps that's the way to go. The thing to remember with geogrids, though, which can be a problem, is in areas where you've got services. You can't put a geogrid in an area that you're going to have to, or you can, but you've got to put them at depth. You certainly can't put a geogrid in an area that you think you might cut through with services at some point in the future. And it's important to make sure that you capture that there's geogrids on site for any future site users. Because what you don't want to do is put in a geogrid at a fairly shallow level and then have somebody decide that they're going to put a new drain in or a new telecom duct and dig the whole thing up and just completely destroys it. And it's no longer really going to be fit for purpose. So that's an important consideration.
Great. Thanks a lot. I'm afraid we might need to leave the questions there. Apologies to anyone whose questions we didn't get around to addressing.
Well, I'm quite happy to. I'm on LinkedIn. If people want to just message me on LinkedIn, I can try and answer questions.
Excellent. That's great. And thank you from myself as well. That was a fantastic talk. Really interesting. Some fabulous photographs of mine workings and some very sage words on the use of the 10 times seam thickness and the requirement for risk assessment. So thank you very much for that. That was excellent, Scott. Thank you.
Thank you.
We would normally give you a round of applause at this point, but alas, I should have had something on record. Finally, just before we go, I'd like to just do a couple of engineering group notices, if I can. Let me try and share. Oops, my apologies. Do you want to? Okay, so here we go. Send live. Right. Okay. Just really a mention of the next meeting, which will be Jeremy Ingham doing a talk on geomaterials and his experience as a geomaterials practitioner. It's the joint event with the BGA, the annual joint event. That's on the 3rd of February. And then for future events, we've got quite a full program for this year. It's filled up quite nicely. You can obviously keep in touch on the various platforms: Gmail, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, etc., etc. And watch out for further postings. So thank you very much to everyone for joining. It's been a great evening, and thank you.
Thank you.